worst of the Reign of Terror was over. The $50 million donation. True or false? Japan demanded a $50 million donation from the Chinese to finance the war. It's false. Yes, they demanded $50 million, but the purpose was not to finance the war. There had been a huge buildup of currency in Malaya in the last years before the war because countries overseas were stockpiling tin and rubber. And so a lot of tin and rubber was shipped out of Malaya and a lot of money came in. When the Japanese came in, they carried with them military currency, which was declared to be the same value as the local currency. And so there was a huge increase in the amount of money circulating in the country, which clearly was going to cause trouble. And the Japanese were very astute about this. They realized they had to get this money out of circulation. So the demand for $50 million was partly to combat inflation by removing currency from circulation. And an additional value of it was going to weaken the Chinese community, which they recognized was going to be a major source of difficulty for them. True or false, the Chinese paid $50 million. Well, this actually turns out to be false too, because actually only $28 million was collected. And the Overseas Chinese Association then borrowed $22 million from the Yokohama Specie Bank to make up the $50 million. True or false, Western films were banned? You would think so. But it didn't happen until September 1943. And I mention this simply because I was astonished to discover that in December 1941, there were 23,000 reels of American, English, Chinese, Malay, and Indian films circulating in Malaya. After Western films were banned, cinemas screened first-run Japanese films and older Malay, Chinese, and Indian films. What about Western music? Well, there were about 1,000 British and US musical pieces banned, including love songs and jazz. Our enemies mixed a deadly potion into their hideous music. But on the other hand, songs that were well assimilated with Nippon sentiments were allowed. So if you wanted to sing Auld Lang Syne, Home Sweet Home, or The Last Rose of Summer, that was fine. Let's look at education. English schools were converted to Japanese schools. But because the students didn't know Japanese, instruction was offered in Malay and English until the students managed to learn Japanese. They had very few textbooks because most of the textbooks contained content that the Japanese found objectionable. Malay schools reopened within a year. The students studied Japanese, but there was a problem because the teachers didn't know Japanese. Indian schools, 3/4 were reopened by the end of 1943. Most Chinese schools, though, stayed closed. There were 1,369 Chinese schools in Malaya before the war. In early 1943, 180 were open. In Singapore before the war, there were 369 Chinese schools. April 1943, 23 had reopened. And many of the pre-war textbooks used in Chinese schools had been burned. There was a bit of higher education, but it was primarily devoted to technical training, studies in engineering, fisheries, agriculture, and things of that sort. And then we come to the Japanese language, Nippongo. Promoted as an Asian lingua franca, it was seen by the Japanese as the key to imbibing the Nippon spirit and culture, seishin. It was a way to sweep away the language of the enemy. It was taught only using katakana, which is one of the two syllabaries. There was no kanji or no characters. And there were a number of issues. There were very few qualified teachers. The textbooks that were available for teaching Japanese to a non-Japanese speaker were mainly in English. And people who didn't know English, of course, wouldn't be able to understand the textbook. Comment in the newspaper said that people were good in picking up the language, but rather backward in imbibing Nippon Seishin. And then we come to what the children did with all this. Now, they were being taught Nippongo, Japanese, and when you learn Japanese, you are taught these collections of syllables, starting with kaki, ku, ke, ko. So what do the kids do? They turn Nippongo into Nippon, go. And they turn kaki, ku, ke, ko into kaki, ku, ben, ko. You have both legs. This must have made the parents very nervous. Anyway, you see in the Shonan Shimbun, the newspaper in Singapore, every day there was a lesson in Japanese. And you see here the students gathered and examples of Japanese. Let's talk a bit about propaganda. There was propaganda, of course, coming from all sides. On the Japanese side, the propaganda emphasized freedom from white domination, the injustice and oppression suffered by the Asian population under colonial rule. The Japanese occupation or the invasion of the Japanese was a way to escape from the divide and rule practices of the colonial rulers. There was an emphasis on the idea of Asia for the Asiatics, co-prosperity, and Hakoichu, 8 corners of the world under one roof, or universal brotherhood. The basic symbols were the national flag, the Hinomaru, the national anthem, bowing to the imperial palace, radio, Taiso exercises. And the Shonan Times ran stories, a couple of examples here. Why is Nippon the strongest nation in the world, nationally, and the most superior racially? The answer, Nippon's spirit, which contains such great virtues as bravery, loyalty, propriety, faith, simplicity, and self-sacrifice. So this is coming from the Japanese side. And this picture comes from early in the occupation, or maybe just before the occupation. As time went on, the quality of the paintings deteriorated dramatically on both sides. But here we see, of course, John Bull being summarily pushed out by people who are, let's assume that these are not people who shouldn't be drinking beer. I'm sure this must be tea or something. And then celebration of a holiday. And here is a propaganda poster. As you see, not nearly so colorful, about building a new Malaya, the Kimigayo. And then we have the Allied propaganda. And this is one of the most fascinating things that I found poking around in the archives. And I'm going to read, this is a summary of what these documents said. I think it's actually worth reading it in a little bit more detail. I had this written, the page number written down, and I forgot to bring the piece of paper, so just give me a second, I'll find it. This comes from a document that was only released or only open to the public in the late 1990s. And what it says, this is the papers of the Special Operations Executive, and it said they were disseminating propaganda worldwide through newspaper stories and radio broadcasts originating in Singapore, and regionally by means of Asian language broadcasts and publications. Through an agreement reached with a worldwide news organization, now I'm assuming this is Reuters, but it's never stated which organization it is, it was possible for us to release news presented from, quote, our point of view, and to release rumors on an international basis. Some 72 newspapers in British and Allied countries were secretly influenced. Indirectly, other major news chains were influenced through this organization. It was one of our most efficient anti-Japanese weapons. Now, in addition, the Oriental Mission of the Special Operations Executive arranged for the preparation of feature films and documentaries, which they released through normal commercial channels. And then here comes the quote that I have on the screen. These pictures, mainly fakes, presented British and anti-Japanese propaganda in a most acceptable form. Well, you see pictures. You see pictures of a Japanese with a sword about to lop off somebody's head. I've seen pictures of a Japanese soldier holding heads dangling by their hair. I've always kind of wondered, was somebody really standing there with his little brownie camera taking a picture while this sort of thing was going on? Or we know that the propaganda people were working with Hollywood. Are some of these propaganda pictures put together? I've been trying to find out about this, and if you look and go into the U.S. archives, there is a vast collection of material that they put together, many, many drafts of what they were trying to put out. And the most amazing of these things, Chet Jen mentioned this article I did in the book about propaganda, basically. And what I found was there's a postcard, some matchbox covers, and so on. The postcard is of the mosque in Kobe, Japan. And the original of this simply says conventional things. There is no God but Allah, and so on and so forth. And what they had done was to remove the original text. And they had replaced it by putting in Jawi, there is no God but Allah, and Hirohito is his prophet. And the idea was that they were going to drop these postcards and matchbooks in the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra. And the population was supposed to believe that the Japanese had been foolish enough to say something like this, and somehow this was going to make them very angry at the Japanese. Allied propaganda also made use of radio broadcasts. They dropped leaflets from aircraft. They sent agents into the country carrying with them a set of rumors that they were supposed to propagate. Now, the propaganda was divided into two kinds. There's white propaganda, which was made up of true statements that they wanted people to know about. And there was black propaganda, and these were fabrications. Among the rumor themes that were being spread, that pigs had been slaughtered in mosques, that Muslims were forced to eat pork, that the Japanese were going to confiscate all businesses. Now, to give you an example of how some of this worked, there were radio scripts which were broadcast into the country. They would take an authentic Japanese broadcast and they would modify it slightly. So where the Japanese broadcast may have spoken of the great Japanese success, they would add something so it said, the great Japanese success against overwhelming military forces. So what they've added is the idea that the Japanese are facing an overwhelming force. They also tried to make it clear that Japan expected the populations of Southeast Asia to fight and die for Japan. So what we have here, the Japanese were trying to get people to enlist in the local forces. So Masoklah menjadi askar pembelak tanah air. And what it says up here is that he has sacrificed his life for Greater East Asia. Ia telah mengorban jiwanya kerana kemuliaan Asia Timur Raya. And what we have here, this is after the fall of Germany and Italy. Japan stands alone. I'll just say something briefly about what happened to the economy during the war. Most of the mines in the States were closed, which meant the workers were unemployed, that were directly employed on those mines in the States, but it also meant that the entire apparatus, the warehousing, the transport, the other sectors, the insurance and so on, that relied on the products of the mines in the States were also out of work. By 1944, a lot of the laborers had been recruited for Japanese military construction projects. The most famous of these, of course, is the Thailand-Burma Railway. But there was a lot of military construction in other places, in the Malay Peninsula and also other parts of Southeast Asia. And there was a lot of movement of people from their homes to work sites. The most famous of these movements is the Ramusha from Java, many of whom were sent up to Malaya and some of them ultimately up to the Burma-Thailand Railway. But when they got to Malaya, there's stories in Singapore of them foraging just at roadsides for food, and every day there were bodies, corpses picked up from the streets because they were starving to death, literally. The transport system pretty much collapsed. Ships, motor vehicles were requisitioned for Japanese military purposes. There were no spare parts because they had all been imported. There was a great shortage of petrol and also lubricants. Rubber oil was made to replace petroleum products, and there were charcoal burners used to power buses. None of this worked very well. And to a great extent, people had to rely on locally produced goods, local food, and so on. There was soy sauce substitutes made from coconut milk, peanuts, potatoes, and starch. Palm sugar replaced imported sugar. Coconut oil replaced imports. Fire was a real problem because the chemicals used to make matches weren't available. And so it became difficult to start fires. People couldn't get commercially produced soap, and so they mixed the ash from burnt coconut shells with palm oil and lime and used it for soap. Couldn't get toothpaste, so people used salt or they used finely ground charcoal in place of commercial toothpastes. And when it comes to food, the pre-war diet averaged about 2,500 calories per day. And of that, Malayan production accounted for just over 200 calories. And the rest of it was imported food. During the occupation, the imports came to a stop. So people began relying on locally grown root crops. They ate bananas, maize, groundnuts, and so on. There was some smuggling of rice, and it went into the black market. By late 1945, Japanese efforts to increase food production had raised the local production to the point that it was generating 520 calories per person per day, which is still far from an adequate diet. After the war, the minimum emergency diet that was used by the Allies was 1,700 calories. So if you're trying to live on 520 calories per day, you're going to suffer from a lot of malnutrition. The curious thing that the Allies found when they came back was that people didn't look as malnourished as they expected. And then they began doing some surveys, and they discovered that the children who were 10 to 14 were the height and weight of healthy children aged 6 to 9. So even though they weren't terribly skinny, their growth had been stunted. This is a propaganda poster to increase the production of food. And what it says here is that a country that doesn't have enough food is weak, and the reason there's not enough, this is the fault of the English before. Ini kesalahan pemerintahan Inggris dulu. There was an increase in disease during the war, a rise in malaria, incidence of malaria, pneumonia, dysentery, diarrhea, skin ulcers, venereal disease, and no medications to treat them. There were a lot of ailments related to malnutrition: anemia, tooth decay, skin diseases, ulcers, bleeding gums, beriberi. Rise in intestinal parasites and waterborne disease. Now, part of the reason for this was that the chemicals that were used for water treatment ran out. Western medicines were no longer imported, so people turned to Chinese medicines, but the Chinese medicine shops had imported some of their ingredients from China, and they could no longer get those, so they couldn't compound medicines as they had before. There was some local manufacture of vaccines, but the supplies were limited and the quality wasn't very good. Quinine, for example, was gone by 1944. So people relied on folk cures. They would use fruit skins, leaves, roots, put together various poultices and so on if they had a wound, and these did not work very well at all. Now, this slide shows the rates of mortality in Singapore, and you can see the rise as we get into the war years, and then 1946, the very sharp declines. And so some of this is going to be disease, some of this would be people being sent off to work camps where the conditions were very bad. So trade largely comes to an end. I won't go through this all in detail, but one of the critical points is that the economy was stagnant, and so there was no tax revenue. So how did Japan pay for the cost of supplies, the government, and so on? Well, the only thing they could think to do was to print money. So the printing presses are turned on, the currency goes up, and of course the immediate thing that happens is that you get inflation. If you look at the circulation of currency notes, 1938, there were $105 million circulating in Malaya. Now, to give you some context for that, you think what the Japanese do at the beginning of the war is ask the Chinese to donate $50 million. So that would be half of the amount of money circulating in the country in 1938. By the end of 1941, this had increased to 220 million. 1942 was up to 285 million. So this is the figures that they're trying to bring down by collecting that $50 million donation. But they kept printing more money. So the guess is that in August 1945, there was $5,000 million in circulation. And the value of $100 pre-war in wartime currency, okay, it stays pretty much at par through 1942, the Japanese currency starts to deteriorate in value as we get into 1943, and you can see by 12th of August 1945, you have it takes about 95,000 in wartime currency to be equivalent to $100 in the pre-war currency. So that tells you that if you win the first prize in the lottery and you get $50,000, you haven't really gotten very much at all. Price rises. Pre-war, a sarong would cost you $1.80. In August 1944, it would cost you $25, and in February 1945, it would cost you $1,000. The pattern is the same as you look down the chart. And Japanese government expenditure, 1941-42, 3,338,000. By 1944-45, the expenditure has gone up to 400 million. Resettlement. There were approximately 30 resettlement schemes for the Chinese population. And resettlement was done initially to try and get people out of the cities into the countryside where they could grow food. As we get into 1945, there's also fear that there are going to be bombing raids that are going to hit the cities. And so part of the reason for moving people out of the cities is to get them away from potential air raids. The most well-known places were Endau down in Johor, called New Shonan. By late 1944, there were around 12,000 residents there, but most of these were people from Singapore, and they knew nothing about growing food. And Bahau, which is in Negri Sembilan, it's primarily a Roman Catholic colony, Chinese and Eurasian. July 1945, there were about 5,000 colonists there. There were also settlements, quite a few other places, including in the Riau Archipelago. And in July 1945, the plans to move people out of Singapore picked up because, again, of the air raids and the food shortages. I want to read you something about Bahau. And I'm sorry, not Bahau, Endau. This is one of my favorite stories from this book. I found this in the oral history archives in Singapore. And so this woman and her husband had relocated to Endau. Now, when they get to Endau, they discover the land that's been allocated to them is heaped up with trees that have been cut. It's not been cleared away. So the first thing they have to do is try and clear this cut timber so they can build a house. Once they've done that, then they go to a sawmill and they get planks from the sawmill. So after living for a time in barracks, this family cleared enough space to construct a house. And the woman rents a bullock cart and goes to see the Japanese in charge of the sawmill. And so this is her account of what happened. The Japanese, he looked, and then he came up. And he says, "You want so much? You want to go and sell black market. You need a small house, no need for so much. I give you half of what you're asking for." The Japanese were very sharp, she says. They know you were going to sell black market. You need only half that amount to build a nice house for yourself. I said, "I don't think so. I need the full amount. I know because I asked my friends. They told me to get all these, so I need all these tons." He said, "No, you want, I give you half. Otherwise, you don't get the planks. I know you're going to black market the planks." So I said, "If you don't give me the planks, I can't build my house. I'm going to sit down here one whole day." My gosh, I could tell you, I was quaking. I was so frightened, but I was acting very brave. So I waited. He went into his office. I couldn't care less. Then he came out again. Something in Japanese. He said, "Still there. Chop head off." I can tell you that feeling. I can still imagine how I felt at that time. "Chop head, all right," I said. "No house? I sit here till you give. I build house, otherwise cannot build." He said, "You can build that house. Can build that house. Enough half." "No," I said. "I sit here till I get my planks." Then he came and made a threatening gesture. My God, I can tell you, I was so frightened. I still remember the fright I got. But I was very determined to get it. So I knew the psychology.